I get a quick show of hands. How many people here are working on a Drupal 8 site right now? Okay, so almost everyone. And of you, how many people use configuration management? Okay, so a lot of you do. Great. So my name is Zachary Weishar. I'm a Drupal developer, and I'm working for a Drupal design, development, and strategy agency based in Waltham, Massachusetts, called Isavera. And before we start, I should say that you don't necessarily need to use configuration management to build a Drupal site. If you're working on a small site with only maybe one environment, maybe you don't need configuration management at all. But if you're working on a site with multiple environments, maybe like dev, stage, prod, then it becomes a lot more valuable. So before we start, we can also go over some of the terms that I'll probably be using during this talk. So first, configuration management. That's the act of managing your configuration. One you might hear a lot is CMI, Configuration Management Initiative. That is like the group of people that first got the configuration management system into Drupal core. Next we have Configuration Management System. I prefer to call it that, although it has the unfortunate coincidence of having the exact same abbreviation as Content Management System. So yeah, we probably shouldn't use that, it's confusing. Configuration System, CS. I think that's the most proper way to call it. Mostly because that's what the core issue key refers to it as. So that seems to be a canonical source of naming convention there. All right. So at a high level, configuration management allows you to take granular control of your database so that you can reliably manage change across your application. So traditionally, Drupal is made up of 3 separate but really interdependent pieces. You have your code base, you have your database, then you have your public file system where your images and files and stuff like that go. So if you want to manage change effectively, you really need a good way to manage the state of all 3 of these pieces. So managing change in code is a problem with a really widely accepted solution. Right? We have version control systems, probably the most popular of which is Git. And it's really good at managing the state of your code. Unfortunately, the same isn't really true for a database. There's no way to, at least none that I know of, to directly put that under version control. And if there is, I would love to know about it. So configuration management kind of bridges the gap there, right? It allows you to export the state of your database into code so that you can manage it along with the rest of your code base. So I'm going to have a quick video here kind of just showing you what that looks like in practice. So I've throughout this talk, I have 2 sites I have set up. I have an example dev site and an example production site. You'll notice the dev site, based on the green bar at the top. When you see the production site, it's going to have a red bar at the top. So on our dev site, we're going to go ahead and create a new content type, create a blog content type. Right now, we're creating configuration through the UI. So that looks great. Have our blog content type. Now, just to show you what effect that has in the database, we have our config table here. This is where all your configuration lives. And just to make it a little bit more readable, I've filtered it to only show content types. So you see our first 2. This is like what gets installed with Drupal under the default installation profile. You have your article content type and your page content type. And we just added a blog post content type, so you can see it showed up there. Now I'm going to go ahead and export that change in the database into code, and that's going to allow me to move it up to production. So I use Drush to do this, although you don't need to use Drush. I'll show you the other way to do it later on. And can you see that? It's kind of cut off. All right, well anyway, it says Drush config export. That's the command to export your configuration. So it warns you, or it tells you what it's about to do. That looks great. And we say yes, go ahead and export. And now just so you can see, these are the changes on the, These are the changes on the file system, right? It just exported these 5 YAML files out for us. So this is valuable because it allows you to easily deploy database updates between your environments in a way that's manageable, right? You know what's going to happen because you've tested this out before. And also, you're not losing this like vital history of the state of your database because it's all tracked in your version control system of choice. So now I'm going to show an example of what it looks like to move configuration up to a new between two environments. Right. So we have our blog post content type, and we want to move that up to production. I should also note before I go on that this is a really trivial example. Like it would be really easy to go into production and just create this content type. It's super easy, but it becomes a lot more valuable as you're creating more complex sites, right? Like say you're setting up a really complex view, you probably don't want to go onto production and recreate that because it's going to take a long time and you're probably going to make mistakes. So this kind of ensures that you don't do that. So we're going to go ahead and commit those files that we just exported and push them up to our Git remote. Then we're going to switch over to our production site and pull down those changes. All right, just so you can see, we haven't imported, nothing's happened yet. And this is the other way that you can import configuration. You can do it through the UI under the configuration synchronization option. And so what this does give you, I think is kind of nice, is a little a diff between what's in the database and what's on your file system. So because we just added these files, there's nothing in the active store to compare against. So these are all new changes. But if you're updating an existing configuration, it's a little bit more helpful because it can show you the way that it's changing. So that all looks great. We'll go ahead and import it. And there was an error there. I don't exactly know what that was, but it worked. So you can ignore that. There it is. Our blog post made it up to production. So if you're using configuration management, essentially you're putting your database under version control. Not really, but kind of close enough. And just to show you, kind of like to drive home the fact that you're managing the state in the history of your configuration, can kind of show you what it looks like to roll back a change. So let's say we just moved that blog post content type up to production, but we realized, oh, we weren't ready to do that. So let's roll it back. So all we need to do, sorry, I know that's cut off, but I'm going to reverse commit that last commit that brought those configuration changes in. So we're going to get rid of them. And now all I need to do is import my configuration again. And it's going to delete those configurations from the database. I should note that if I had gone ahead and created a few blog post nodes, this wouldn't be quite as easy. I would need to go actually delete those nodes first before it would let me get rid of that configuration. But in practice, you have your history managed by Git.
Now, would it just fail on the delete? It would just say you can't do it because there's content creation?
Yeah, exactly. It would say there's entities of this type. You need to go ahead and delete those before. All right. So I think it's helpful to take a quick look back at Drupal 7 just to like understand what we have in Drupal 8 and how much of an improvement I think it is. So you could do this same thing in Drupal 7 through features and StrongArm mostly. But there are definitely some advantages to doing this the way that we do it in Drupal 8. So these solutions have treated us really well in Drupal 7 for a long time, but there's definitely some shortcomings, right? First and foremost, it lives in the contributed module space, so there's no centralized API in core for module developers to export their configuration. So you had a couple options in Drupal 7. You could use Entity API exportables or CTools exportables, but you had to choose, and that's not great. Second, Features wasn't really designed to act as a central configuration store for a complex site. Really, it was designed to bundle up small pieces of site functionality and move them between different sites. And because of that, working with features can be frustrating when you're using it to manage configuration for an entire site, right? Configuration can become spread across a bunch of different features modules, which makes it really hard to keep track of. And also, these features modules can start to have interlocking dependencies, which makes changing them really hard. So that's obviously not great. Also, features tends to kind of throw everything into these really long files, really big files. So when you have multiple developers working on a project, it's really easy to run into merge conflicts in those files. And those files are not, it can be hard to resolve those merge conflicts because those files can be hard to read. Finally, Features is really good at creating things, but it can't actually delete them. So in order to do what I just showed you with deleting that blog post content type in Drupal 7, you would need to first remove that code from Features, and then write an update hook to actually delete that content type from the database. So it's a little more convoluted. So in Drupal 8, all those problems are addressed, which is awesome. We have the centralized API in core, which is what we're talking about now, the configuration system. All of your configuration lives cleanly in your sync directory. You don't need to make decisions about how it's organized. That's all taken care of for you. Resolving merge conflicts is a lot easier. And actually, I should say they just happen a lot less often because the way that the configuration system works is that it splits up everything into really small files. So everything's really focused, and it's a lot less likely that two people are going to be making changes to the same configuration file at the same time. And finally, as we just saw, the configuration system is capable of deleting things, which is great. So, last note, in Drupal 8, Features isn't dead. It's still around, and it's actually, it's free to do what it was meant to do, which is good. All right, now just some general notes about the configuration system, kind of some things that you should know about it. So, the configuration system is designed to move configuration between different instances of the same site, not two separate sites. And so the way that Drupal identifies a site is through a UUID, or a Universal Unique Identifier. And what this means in practice is that you should really set up, let's say you have your dev site and you want to set up your staging site, you should set up your staging site from a database dump of your dev site. Or at least that's the easiest way to do it. And that's going to ensure that your UUIDs match, and then that will allow you to move your configuration between them. When I first started using the CS in Drupal 8, I didn't know this, and so I was really confused when I tried to move up my local changes to the dev site, and it said, "Oh, you can't do this because these are different sites." And I was like, "What's going on there?" So, if you want to know where that UUID lives, it's right here in the system.site.yaml file, or in the system.site row of your config table in your database.
It's pretty easy to export it and import it with Drush too.
Yeah. You can change it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's see. Yeah. So another thing to note: modules and themes can provide default configuration. This configuration is imported when they're installed, and they live in the module's config install or config optional directory, which you can see an example of here. This is the aggregator module in core. So kind of piggybacking on that, site's own configuration, not modules. So once you do that initial install of that module, that configuration is installed, and at that point your site takes over. Any future changes to that module's default configuration won't be reflected unless you uninstall it and reinstall it. So, just one thing to note, it can be confusing when you're trying to edit a module's default configuration and you are confused about why it's not doing anything. Another thing we have in Drupal 8 is dependency calculation. So oftentimes Drupal sites can be really big and complex with a lot of interlocking dependencies. And so what dependency calculation tries to do is kind of save you from yourself. Let's say you're deleting something and you think, there's no dependencies on this, you're fine, but actually you just broke another part of your site without realizing it. Dependency calculation should, in theory, save you from doing that. And I'll show you a quick example of what that looks like. So we have our blog post content type. So let's go ahead and create a view. We want to create a blog post landing page, a blog landing page to show a list of blog posts. So obviously this view is reliant. It depends on the blog post content type. So go ahead and save that view. Then let's see what happens when we try to delete the blog post content type. So it gives you this screen warning you, okay, this is what's about to happen. The things at the top make sense, that's what we would expect. Those are all directly related to the blog post content type. The thing you might not expect is at the bottom here. It's going to delete that view that we just created because it's dependent on it. So for better or worse, Drupal's trying to save you from yourself.
So it won't prevent you, it'll just let you know that this is going away too.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully you pay attention to that before you delete it. All right, next we have this concept of configuration stores. So when you first install Drupal, and actually most often, the active configuration store is going to be your database. And so the active configuration store just means where configuration is currently being read from by your application. But the app, okay, I should say too, when you export your configuration, you're moving it between different stores, right? You're taking it from the active store, probably the database, and putting it onto your file system, which is another configuration store. And also, configuration stores are configurable, so you could change out the active configuration store to be, something like Redis or Mongo or whatever you want. Last note, in Drupal 7, all variables were global. Think about like the commands variable set, variable get. That made them really easy to access, but also you had to load them into memory on every page load, so it's not super efficient. In Drupal 8, variables are only brought into memory when they're needed, so it's a little more efficient. I should note, by the way, too, if you have questions, feel free to stop me as I go along. So there are 4 main categories of data in Drupal 8, and this is going to kind of help us understand what configuration actually is. So first you have state. This is information of a temporary nature, generally machine generated, about the current state of your site. Makes sense? Examples of this would be the last time that cron was ran, whether node access permissions need rebuilding. And when I first started to kind of wrap my head around these concepts, I was a little confused about what was state and what wasn't. So a couple of general rules. You're dealing with state when the data is specific to an individual environment, and you're never going to want to move it between environments because it's just not important. Like if you reset your system, you're going to lose your state, but your configuration is going to stay around because that is vital to the function of your application. Next, we have session. This is information about individual users' interaction with the site. It's really similar to state, actually, but it's just specific to user interaction with the site. Next, we have content. We're probably all familiar with this. Things that are meant to be displayed on your site. Articles, basic pages, images, files, etc. Last, we have configuration. This is information about your site. It's generally, or at least can be, human edited, and it's meant to be relatively permanent because it's important. You're building your application around that configuration. Examples of this would be content types, like we saw with the blog post, or views, amongst many other things. So, kind of helping you distinguish content from configuration. Content would be traditionally created by site authors. These are kind of like Drupal-y terms, but that's all right. Site authors, and then configuration would be more created by site builders. Another way to think of it, configuration are types of things, and content are those things. So an article content type versus article nodes. And it's important to kind of keep this distinction in mind because it's not always clear and can become kind of confusing, which we'll show here. There are definitely some gray areas. So blocks themselves are content, but where you place them in your, what region you place them in, that's configuration. So the CS handles the second part there, where it's placed and some other general information about it. It doesn't actually manage its content at all. And the same is really true for menus. So menus themselves are configuration, but the menu items are content. So that, if you don't keep that in mind, you can run into these kind of confusing scenarios, like I'll show here. So we're going to add a new block to our dev site. That looks great. Go ahead and place it in the sidebar region. And we can see that it showed up. That looks great. We want to move that to production. So we go ahead and export our configuration. Yep, looking good. We can add all those file changes and then push it up to our remote. We'll pull those changes in, and we'll import our configuration. Now we go to our production site. We refresh the page. Look at that. Oop. Yeah, look at that. We can see that the block placement configuration was successfully transferred to production. Exactly what we'd expect. So now let's go ahead and see what that looks like on the front end. Oh, that's not what we expected. I don't know, that's a little small, but that's the broken block handler. That says this block is broken or missing. You might be missing content, or you might need to enable the original module. So that's kind of confusing, and I did not expect that when I first started working with the CS. And I'll kind of give you a way to get around this at the end. All right, so now we can move into the tips and tricks, ways that you can kind of improve the way that you work with the CS. So by default, Drupal sets up a configuration sync folder for you when you run through the install script, and that lives by default here. So sites default files config underscore the UUID for your site. And so the idea there is that your configuration store probably has some sensitive information in it that you don't want people, outsiders, to be able to access. So you're kind of taking the security through obscurity route by appending that UUID to the end, because that's going to be something that's really hard for someone to guess. But you can actually go a step further, because the configuration sync directory is configurable. You can move it wherever you want. So in this example here, I've moved it outside of my web root, so it can never be served by the web server, but still is tracked by Git, because at least at Isovera, we track one level above the web root. All right. Another thing to know is that by default, configuration synchronization is destructive. So if you have something, it's taking what's on your file system and importing it into the database and destroying anything that's not there. So that's good, I guess. Keeps things clean, but it can be, you can get yourself into trouble if you're not aware of that. So one flag that you can pass to Drush when doing this is config import partial. And what that's going to do is say, okay, import anything that's new, change anything that already exists, but don't delete anything that's not tracked on my file system already. And just a quick example, I'll show you what that looks like and how you might get yourself into that situation. So let's say we're a developer working on our dev site here. We're making some changes. We're going to be responsible. We're moving things up and committing them to version control in a safe way. While we're doing that, maybe one of our content authors, they just took a Drupal training course, and so now they're ready to go ahead and create some views. Yeah, directly on production. They're really empowered, which is, that's great. That's one thing that you can do with Drupal. It's not necessarily bad. But it is bad if you deploy and then blow that away without knowing so. Yep. So, okay, they created their configuration in production. It's not tracked in Git. And now we're ready, as a developer, to move what we just did on the dev site up to production. Okay. So what we can see at the bottom here is that the standard config import command, it's going to delete that view that we did, that our content author just created. So that doesn't look good. We don't want to delete that. Let's go ahead and pass the partial flag in. And now instead of deleting it, it's not going to do that. So it's less destructive. So there's another flag that you can pass, config export, would be the skip modules flag. This is going to be helpful when you're working locally. Say you have modules such as devel, whose configuration you never want to export, right? Because you don't want devel enabled in production, so there's no point in exporting its configuration. An easy way to make sure that you don't do that is to pass in this flag, skip modules. And that way you can make sure that none of that devel configuration ever makes it up to where it shouldn't be. All right. Hold on one second. I need to drink some water. next we have config split. This is probably one of my favorite configuration-related modules. It's really cool. So what it allows you to do is to store different versions of your configuration files based on what environment, based on your different environments. So a good example of this would probably be caching settings, right? When you're working locally, you probably don't want your caching settings turned on because it slows you down. You have to clear the cache all the time. It's just easier to leave them off. In production, you definitely want your caching settings turned on for performance reasons. So, I should say too that this is a really simple example. You could handle this through an override in settings.php really easily, but as things become more complex, config split sort of starts to make more sense, especially when you have scenarios where you want one module enabled in one environment and not enabled in another. Config split is really good at handling that. So I have a video here kind of showing us what it looks like to use config split. Before I start, I should note that I filmed this video probably a few months ago, and since then a few things have changed with config split, so I'll call those out as we see them. So I've already gone ahead and installed the module, and I've set up two splits, one for each environment we have. We have our dev split and our prod split. Okay, so you can see here you tell config split where those files are, or where the directory that it should store things in are. So we have config sync prod to store our production configurations, production specific configurations I should say, and then the rest of our configuration just lives in config sync, and that configuration is shared between all sites. So go ahead, and this is one thing that's changed. This is no longer called blacklist, and now I can't remember what it's called now. But in any case, that's one thing to watch out for. So what I'm saying here is that I want the system.performance configuration file to be managed by my production split. So that looks good.
So the blacklist is what you want included into this, and that's kind of an interesting.
Yeah,
it's maybe why they changed it.
The naming is really confusing, and there's gray list here at the bottom, which is even more confusing. But yeah, blacklist is basically saying if this file lives in the prod sync, it lives in the prod split, and so it should not live at all in the main default split. It only lives here. The gray list, what that does is say, this configuration file can live in the main sync directory, but if it is present in this sync, use this version instead.
So that's fine. You use the gray list, or
the gray list is helpful. So let me think of an example. Shoot. Okay, I'm having trouble thinking of an example.
No worries.
We use the gray list to set the actual performance settings actually.
Okay.
For caching and stuff between environments.
Yep, that would be a good use of it.
Blacklist would be for
Modules that are only on one environment.
Yeah.
Right. So when you're using the blacklist, you have to store a separate copy of that each split in order for it to work. So yeah, gray lists probably make more sense for more targeted overrides.
So the new language is conditional split instead of gray list and complete split instead of
okay, I think that's probably a better.
Yeah.
They tried to figure that out for a while.
It makes a lot more sense. So okay, we'll go ahead and save here. So now let's create the caching settings that we want in production. So I'm not saying these are the best caching settings, I'm just giving this as an example. So we go ahead and save that. Okay, this is another thing that's changed. The command I'm using here is csex config split export. You don't actually need to use that anymore as long as you have a version of Drush that's newer than 8.1.10, I believe. And actually I found that instead now you can use the core config export, config import configuration, and it just integrates nicely with config split. you can still use this command even on newer versions of Drush, although I've definitely found that the core commands tend to work better, especially when you need to like enable and disable different modules.
So you don't have to like explicitly say, I want this split configuration. It'll look for it and know it's there. And
So that's a good question. Yeah, when you're using this command, you pass in the split name at the end. When you're using the core command, it looks. So I probably should have shown this in the video, but there's a way to set the active split. So what I would do is kind of explicitly set that in my settings.php, saying, okay, right now my active split is production. So then when I'm exporting this configuration, it's going to go into the right directory. And then after I'm done, I switch back to local. That's like one of my biggest complaints actually about this workflow is that you have to kind of keep in mind what split you're trying to export to and what's active so that it actually works correctly. It can be a little confusing. So yeah, let's go ahead and export. And then we can see here, just for an example, because we're using the blacklist, it exported that configuration file that we specified to the prod split. I don't know if you can see that there, but it's config sync prod. So that looks good. Go ahead and commit that. Push it up. Now we're in production. And we'll pull in those changes. And just so we can see, before we import anything, the caching settings are the same as they were on the development environment. Okay. Just like we're using the old command again here, config split import. Again, you don't need to use that as long as you have that newer version of Drush. And so one thing that you need to set up, I guess, when you're setting up your different environments is a way for it to. It needs to know what the active split is, basically. So I think the easiest way is to use settings.php or settings.local.php. And just you can export one line to say basically this is the prod split. Anytime we're importing configuration, you should be importing it from the production split. So as long as you do that for each environment, yeah, you won't run into any problems using the core config import command. All right, and just so you can see, great, yeah, we got our caching settings, and now we can go ahead and change them back on our local and not worry about them anymore. All right. So I also had this concept of like a way to ignore certain configurations. So specifically with things like block placement, that is considered configuration, although it's really strict of you to say, okay, content editor, you can never change the order of the blocks on your site. Like in practice, I think most clients aren't going to like that, or most owners of a site. So one idea I had was to use config split to ignore configuration. The idea was to set up an ignored split and then actually ignore that from Git. So that way each environment could manage that configuration kind of as they saw fit. Now there's a config ignore module. You should probably use that. It's a little, it's more targeted, and this is sort of convoluted. Another useful module you can use would be configuration read-only. This is very strict. You're not allowing any configuration changes on production. If you do try to do that while config read-only is enabled, you're going to get this nice message saying, hey, you can't do that because we're in read-only state. Again, that's really strict and probably not, I don't know, maybe it's useful for certain use cases, but I haven't found a client that would be acceptable for, personally. Okay, another cool module that we have is configuration installer. What this module does is help you get around the UUID issue. So it lets you install a site from existing configuration. And what that looks like, let's say when you go through the installation steps through the UI, it's going to have this extra option at the bottom. Just it's functioning as an installation profile, I should say. So it has this configuration installer installation profile. You select that. It asks you where the sync directory is that it should be importing from, and then you go along your way, and it imports everything for you. You can do that. You're kind of tied to an installation profile after that, so it's maybe not, has its downsides. You can also use Drush to change the site UUID, and that's going to let you install a site from existing configuration by just making sure those IDs match. Yep.
So I've done the config installer before in the past, and I know there was some work being done. I'm just curious if you know the state of this. Like Drush, when you're installing a site for the first time, they were working on something where you could actually pass like the config dir, so you build with the correct UID instead of config setting it after the fact, which it looks like we're doing here.
Right.
You could actually build the site with the correct UIDs. Have you followed that or used that at all?
I haven't tried that, although that would be really nice.
Yeah, it seems like it's something would be nice to have.
Yeah, I actually wasn't aware of that, so yeah, thank you for sharing that. I should look into it.
Is there anything different with Composer to get an install profile? Or does the
Good question.
Drupal Composer project automatically put it in the profile?
It should.
I think you just have to define it in Composer JSON where it puts the different Drush type of things. Modules versus install profiles and themes.
Okay, I just didn't know if that project did that already.
Yeah, I think it does define those. I think it's called installer paths, and it sets those up for you. So I guess I should note here that this command is actually changing the UUID in the database, not on your file system. So yeah, you can just keep that in mind, I guess. All right. So last I have an example kind of showing you one way at least to get around that gray area of content versus configuration. Remember we tried to deploy that block and we kind of unexpectedly saw the broken block handler on production. So there's a module out there called default content, and I think it's a really elegant way to kind of get around that problem. So just as we did before, we're going to create this example sidebar block on a development site. We're going to place it in the same region. There it is. Okay, this video is really fast and also really small. But let's see. You probably can't read that, but what that says is Drush DCE, so default content export. You pass it in the type of entity that you're exporting, in this case block content, and then the ID of that entity, which in this case is the first block we've ever created, so it has an ID of 1. And then lastly, you pass it in a file. You tell it where you want it to save it on your file system. And so what that's going to do is export that block content in a JSON file to your file system. And so what that's going to allow you to do is package that up along with your configuration so that you can deploy it all together and not worry about the the dependency on your content.
Now, what happens if you export that locally with an ID of 1 and your client has already created a custom block on production?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
So okay, we exported it, and so what we can see here is our configuration for the placement. That's what we expect. And then what I'm showing here is what the JSON output of that default content export looks like. So that looks great. Let's commit that and push it up. We'll move over to prod, pull everything down. We'll import. That looks great. And look at that. First time, no broken block handler. The content made it up, and the placement made it up. One big happy family. We're good to go. So just in order to use default content, I'll just show you an example of how I set this up. You have a very simple custom module with nothing in it except a .info.yaml file. And all you have to do in that YAML file is declare default content as a dependency. And then you have to keep this folder naming structure like that. There's documentation on this online, so you don't have to remember this, but just to show you that it's really pretty simple to set this up. So there's definitely some caveats with the way that default content is in its current state. First, content is only imported when the module is first enabled. So the example that I showed, default content wasn't enabled in production before I deployed, so that's why it worked. If I were to add a second block and try to deploy again, it wouldn't import it because the module is already enabled in production. So there's luckily for us, there's a patch on Drupal.org that fixes that, and it allows you to do manual Drush imports of content even after the module has already been enabled, which is like the more useful use case for what I'm talking about here. I think default content was probably created, this is just a side note, to work well with like installation profiles. So like, you have an installation profile with all of your configuration bundled up, and because of these weird couple of dependencies between configuration and content, this provides you a way to import that content. So now going on to your ID question. Yes, if that ID already exists, it's going to throw a fatal error. So what you can do is use this patch again on Drupal.org. And what that's going to do is, if that ID already exists, it's just going to update whatever content that is to match what's on your file system. And both those patches are pretty far along, so I think this should hopefully make it into the module pretty soon. And that's it. Are there any questions?
Have you seen, I think there's a module out there called Recreate Block Content that does something similar. It's more of an intermediary where if you're inputting a block placement from the config, it'll just put placeholder text basically in that block so that you can actually import it without it being a broken block.
Okay. I haven't seen that actually. That's
There's a
interesting.
similar one for menus as well.
So it would create the block with just some dummy text, and then you would go and like change the content to whatever you want.
Have it empty, and then at least you can go in
That's pretty smart. That's a good way to do it.
without destroying things. Or that one's a little more destructive.
Yeah, totally. Like like in the example you gave, if your client had already created a block, you would destroy it by doing this. So take that as you will. All right.
Do you have any idea why, maybe there's a structural reason for this, but like why they, default content creators, designed it to be like a separate module with JSON? Why, there's a reason why it just wasn't YAML that gets put into config? Like,
it's a good question, and honestly, I don't know. There's a whole there's pretty actually detailed discussion about this in the issue queue. I haven't read all the way through it, so I don't know, but I think that information is out there on the structural reasons for why they did this. I think default content has gotten some recognition for Drupal's API First initiative as a way to provide default content. So these architectural decisions are documented in the issue queue.
and if I could just ask one. So in your example, you defined a very specific ID. Is there a way to, either with Drush or just programmatically define I want all block content exported?
So if you don't pass an ID, that's what the default is. Yeah. It'll export all content entities of that type. All right. So last question I have for you is, who wants a shirt? First two people can have one. Just raise your hand. Okay, Jim. Anyone else?
Thank you.
No, that's awesome. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.